So we left off on the last page by discussing toxic chemicals in the environment and the reality that for every chemical that we know causes harm, there are many more for which we simply can't say whether they cause harm because their effects haven't been studied. This transitions us sort of naturally into our next section, which looks at the different guiding principles around how people make decisions about the environment. There are two major schools of thought when it comes to making decisions about whether to proceed with actions and innovations that could potentially cause harm. The difference between these two schools of thought hinges on the question of how much confirmation do we need that something is safe before we put it into action. The first school of thought, known as the proactionary principle, says that the risks of a particular action should be assessed based on whatever scientific evidence is available. If there is some uncertainty, then so be it, because the proactionary principle prioritizes things like freedom to innovate, the importance of economic growth, and national and international competitiveness in the global market. The precautionary principle, on the other hand, says that if there is uncertainty about whether a decision or an action will cause harm, the right course of action is to hold off because the risk of harm is greater than the reward. And if and when a robust body of evidence is gathered indicating that the action is safe to pursue, only then does the precautionary principle say to move forward. So, as you can see, in the proactionary principle, the default is do, and in the precautionary principle, the default is don't. Compared to the precautionary principle, the proactionary principle is more friendly to situations where there is little to no evidence available because it assumes that by defaulting no on a decision, you'd be missing out on an opportunity that could bring about economic benefit or better quality of life. But at the same time, some decisions do carry a significant risk of harm in the face of uncertainty. And so it's important to strike a balance between the proactionary principle and the precautionary principle. We don't want to continue to devastate the environment, but we also don't want to completely gridlock technological and social progress. And while we're on the topic of guiding principles around environmental issues, it's also valuable to talk about different philosophies that people hold about what the environment is worth. Because what people think the environment is worth ultimately serves as the justification for how they treat it. So, what is the environment worth? And I actually invite you to pause the video and think for just a quick moment on this question. What is the environment worth to you? If your answer is that the environment is worth what it provides to you in terms of food, resources, energy, products, then that is called a utilitarian justification. The utilitarian view is that it's important to protect the parts of the environment that have utility to humans, or in other words, the parts that benefit people economically. On the other hand, if your answer is that the ecosystems themselves are valuable, not just because of the role that they play in supporting humans, but the role that they play in supporting other species and the overall ecological balance of the earth, then this is called the ecological justification. So the ecological view is that the environment must be preserved because earth systems ranging from the water cycle to ocean currents to the predictable changing of the seasons, these systems have value that support life as we know it. If your answer is that the worth of the environment lies in its intrinsic beauty and you get value from the environment in the form of recreation, spiritual connection, mental well being, then this is called the aesthetic justification. And lastly, if you argue that ecosystems and the species that inhabit them have a right to exist, and we have an ethical obligation as humans to protect them, then this is called the moral justification. Of course, very few people's concept of environmental worth falls squarely in one of these categories alone, and instead we all have complex notions of what the environment is worth that draw from these different schools of thought in varying amounts. What we can say is that the environment is worth something to everyone, whether or not they realize it. And so, acknowledging that the environment holds this universal worth for human life, and acknowledging that future generations of people are going to need the environment just as much as we do, it's important to act in ways that are consistent with preserving the Earth's finite resources for those future generations. This way of thinking about the Earth and future generations is called a sustainable ethic. A sustainable ethic is based on the idea that the earth has limited resources, that humans have a responsibility to conserve those resources for future generations, that humans must also share those resources with other living things on earth, that long-term continuous growth, for example, of the world population, of the economy, is not possible within the limits of a finite world with finite resources. Humans are part of nature too, and so we are a part of those interdependent systems. And if humans disregard the limits of the systems that they are a part of, there will be harmful consequences. Instead, humans have to work in harmony with Earth systems. Now, a sustainability ethic can be either anthropocentric or biocentric in nature. If your sustainable ethic is anthropocentric, what that means is that it's motivated by the interests of people, future generations of people. Whereas if it leans biocentric, that means it's motivated by the interests of the environment in its own right. So, for example, if we're faced with a problem that is how to deal with and solve an oil shortage, um, to do this in a way that's consistent with a sustainable ethic would involve reducing fuel consumption or finding renewable fuel alternatives, rather than expanding oil drilling. However, the anthropocentric reasoning in this situation would be to reduce consumption so that oil can be conserved for use by future generations of people, whereas a biocentric reasoning would be because expanded oil drilling would do immediate harm to other non human living things. There's actually another, even more inclusive ethical concept of the environment that we'll touch on before closing out this section, and that is the land ethic. So, the land ethic was an idea advanced by a man named Aldo Leopold, who was a wildlife natural historian and philosopher in the first half of the 1900s. And he authored a book called A Sand County Almanac, in which he puts forth this idea that although many cultures have viewed land as property, land and all of its elements cannot truly be owned. And he likened this ownership of land to the ownership of people, or in other words, slavery. And when he used the word land, what he really meant was ecosystems. He meant the land and everything that it includes, soils, waters, plants, and animals. And he argued that domineering over those things was immoral. So his stance was that it's wrong to consider the only worth of the environment to be its economic necessity to serve humans, and that even parts of the environment that don't serve humans ought to be preserved. So his views can sort of be summed up in the following quote from his book: anything is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends to do otherwise.